think we're ready to get started. Amy, if you want to share your screen. Again, welcome. This is the Great American Outdoors Act Part 1. We are calling it Lessons Learned and How to Use Them to Win the Win. We'll be discussing the lessons we learned from this winning campaign. And immediately following this session is the Great American Outdoors Act Part 2 that Ron Tipton will lead on how to engage in the Great American Outdoors Act funding for the benefit of trails. So we encourage you to stay on for that one too. My name is Kathy DeCoster. I'll be moderating our discussion today. I worked on the Land and Water Conservation Fund for most of my 25 years at the Trust for Public Land, and then as a consultant to the Partnership for the National Trails System. Our presenters today will be Amy Lindholm, the LWCF Coalition Manager for the Appalachian Mountain Club, and Tyler Ray, the Director of Policy and Advocacy for the American Hiking Society. So, next slide. Here's a rhetorical question, mostly. What do these three have in common? Not much, right? These days. Next slide. What legislation generates glowing headlines from outlets as diverse as the New York Times, Field and Stream, Lonely Planet, the Daily Lobo, and The Hill? The answer to that is why we're all here. It's the Great American Outdoors Act. This landmark once-in-a-generation legislation that was enacted into law in August addresses two longtime conservation and recreation needs: full and dedicated funding of the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and a new infusion of capital funding to address the deferred maintenance backlog at our national parks and other public lands, including trails. And next slide, please. This is not a rhetorical question. Why does GAOA matter for the trails community? Well, it provides consistent funding for protection and access improvements for trails at all levels, federal, state, and local. And it also addresses trail maintenance and construction needs that improve access and the overall trail experience now and into the future. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amy to discuss the LWCF part of GAOA.
Just unmute myself here. Thank you. Thanks, Kathy, and thanks everybody for joining today. At a time when good news can be really hard to come by, I am absolutely thrilled to join you all today to talk about a really huge victory for conservation and recreation. I can't emphasize enough what a big deal this is. Full and permanent funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund has been one of the highest policy priorities for the Appalachian Mountain Club and for folks in the greater trails community and conservation community for decades. And it's not hard to understand why, because it's the country's most important source of federal conservation and recreation funding. So I think many of you are familiar with the program at this point, but I'll just run through a couple of slides that describe what LWCF is and what it does and the broader impact that it has. This is a 55-year-old program that has a huge track record of success. It is a big, broad toolbox that empowers a vast array of different types of projects, from saving and opening up those missing puzzle pieces of our national parks, forests, refuges, and trail corridors, to expanding and improving close-to-home recreation opportunities at state and local parks, feeder trails, rail trails, greenways, and playgrounds, to protecting our drinking water, keeping forests as forests, and supporting sustainable timber operations, to building climate resilience with natural infrastructure, habitat connectivity, and carbon storage. And these are core values for us because access to this protected land really underpins all of our work in the trails community, everything that we're about. So, this is something that's only gaining in importance as we deal with a changing climate and continuously growing population. Now, a pandemic that has shown us more than ever the value of getting outside and of protecting nature. The impacts of this that play out on the ground are not just about physical and mental health, about the environment and recreation and access, equitable access to the outdoors, but they're also about the economy. This all translates into a huge economic driver that provides diverse job, economic diversification and jobs in lots of different types of communities, urban and rural, and everything in between. So these next slides run through some examples of the particular places and projects that illustrate the kinds of things I've just been talking about, and where LWCF has invested across the country. From Cape May in New Jersey in building coastal climate resilience, to Sterling Forest in New York and doing really important drinking water protection, to places like Rocky Mountain National Park and protecting key inholdings. And one gateway to the park was recently protected, safeguarded not just the natural resources, but the visitor experience at that park. The Continental Divide Trail, that's the Pacific Crest Trail. Continental Divide is another great example. LWCF has expanded access to trails, connected trails, protected trail corridors and view sheds all across the country, and we're going to talk more about that in a second. To close to home parks, this is Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens in Washington, D.C., a great place to escape when you have young children in the middle of the District of Columbia, which I once did, to those vast, large landscape protection and wilderness inholdings at places like Yukon Flats in Alaska. These are all of the national trails here that have received LWCF investment. The national trail system overall is not entirely protected. A lot of trail parcels and connections don't have legal protections in place, and easements can change over time. As we know, trails need to be relocated sometimes for safety reasons or because of sensitive habitat. So you have older trails like the AT that is entirely connected but still needs viewshed and corridor protection. Trails like the PCT and Continental Divide Trail that are now working toward being fully connected, and then younger trails like the North Country National Scenic Trail that have a long way to go, and LWCF is really critical to that completion. And so now with the Great American Outdoors Act, we hope to expand this list a lot more. Here are some particular examples: the AT, Trail of Tears, CDTC, and the Overmountain Victory National Historic Trail in Tennessee. So now we're going to turn to the politics in the campaign, the advocacy campaign that we just completed. And I'm going to turn first to Kathy for a poll question.
So we want to just get a sense of your congressional representation, those of you on the session. It's not intended as a gotcha question, but rather just to get a sense of your congressional delegation and how much they were engaged with us on the GAOA campaign. Where you don't know the answer, let us know your state that you live in. That would be helpful too. We'll capture that and go through it a little bit later. And also we want to be able to help you connect with your representation as our work continues. So please go ahead and answer in the chat now what you know about your congressional representation. Can you name your senators? One or two of them. Can you name your House representative? And if you know what congressional district number you're in. And we'll start to capture those. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. So we've established this as a critically important and successful program. with all sorts of arrows in the quiver that communities can use to address their many needs and priorities. And yet we've never been able to fully utilize these tools, because for the last 55 years, while the designated money was dutifully set aside for LWCF each year, more than half of it ended up being diverted to other unrelated things instead of being appropriated to projects. So fixing this injustice and unleashing the true power of LWCF has been the holy grail of the conservation community, including AMC, for the last quarter century. And we've finally done it after so many years of work, especially in the last decade of the dedicated, coordinated LWCF Coalition campaign. Full and permanent funding has passed through Congress. So I want to talk about how that happened and what we've learned from it, the years of foundation setting advocacy tactics, and the specific events of the last few years and months leading to passage of this major legislation. So this slide shows how unique attributes of this program give us both challenges to deal with and also opportunities that we can capitalize on, and how they inform the campaign. It's a bipartisan nationwide program with something for everyone, and yet it's also hyper-local and has a long history of success. But that success has been tempered by the chronic raiding of funds. That big, broad support goes across the country, but doesn't always go deeply. And there's been a lot of education and branding that has been needed to really raise the profile of this program and connect it to the places that people love. And the many small stakeholders across the country don't have a ton of capacity to do advocacy, and it was really important to bring them all together to speak with one voice on this program. And so that has been the mission of the Land and Water Conservation Fund Coalition. It has everything from large national environmental groups to recreation user groups like us in the trails community, outdoor businesses, sportsmen, historic preservationists, ranchers, and timber companies, everyone across the board, all preserving their own distinct voices, but singing from the same hymn book, and really connecting this kind of wonky acronym with real places and real people and real communities on the ground. So these are kind of our campaign building blocks that I like to talk about, that show how we lay the foundation, build and create momentum, and capitalize on opportunities for success. So first, on the left-hand side here, you have this baseline of support and advocacy to educate people and members of Congress and connect the dots for them, providing Congress with the stories of how the program impacts people on the ground, and also providing those folks on the ground with information about what's happening in Congress and how it affects them directly. And we use events and site visits, we get the members out to the landscape, we get the small stakeholders into DC to meet with their lawmakers, we use the press and social media. And then on top of that, we have built momentum based on external events. LWCF actually expired in 2015. We saved it temporarily and used the urgency of losing the program altogether to fuel a major campaign to save it permanently. And then we built on that win to fuel the next one on permanent funding. And so then the third row here, a column on the right-hand side, is how we look for openings and chances to break through by building champions on both sides of the aisle who are real believers in the program and believers in this being a good political issue for them. And when their political fortunes rise or fall, it helps to generate action. And we build pressure from those champions and rank and file members of Congress on leadership to get this on the agenda, and watch what's happening in Congress overall to look for moments of political opportunity in packages where this can move forward. So here's some examples of this kind of advocacy in action. That's kind of the theoretical framework. And now I want to talk about some of the specific things we did at AMC as part of the Trails community and the larger LWCF Coalition to contribute to this campaign. As I mentioned earlier, the key to success has been for each partner to use their distinct voice and leverage their work on the ground, as well as their relationships with local partners and communities and members of Congress to connect those dots from each unique place to the national level. So here's a mapping tool we use to do that. we're kind of a quintessential user group, and that we don't do LWCF projects like a land trust, we use them. Our members are out there in the outdoors, from backyards to the backcountry, and we see firsthand how protecting lands boosts the health and quality of life and the economy of these communities. And we can tell those stories. Once we connect the dots, we can tell those stories in the press and social media and to members of Congress. We've leveraged our chapters who are eager to participate in policy, especially when it also means getting outside. Here's an event we did, connecting the dots for people. Most people would never think of Boston Common and the public gardens as a place that has benefited from LWCF investment, or as a place to hike, but it's both. And we did this event to raise awareness, and then, amplified it on social media. There's a couple other hikes that the Delaware Valley chapter did down in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And here's an event we did up in Maine with Senator Collins. We work with our champions to both get them outside to see these places firsthand, and then also to celebrate the roles that they've played and thank them. This is after we won permanent reauthorization last year, and helped, use that positivity and those thanks and that celebratory messaging as fuel for our next victory this year on permanent funding. There's another example out with Congressman McGovern on the New England National Scenic Trail, a press conference in DC with Congressman Zeldin, Republican of New York, and a project in New Hampshire with the children running there along the Appalachian Trail on the New Hampshire-Vermont border, where I met with Senator Shaheen last year to talk about, again, that victory and say thank you, and motivate her to keep on fighting until we got permanent funding. So bringing it all together, politics plays a huge role. We can't escape that. You have to understand the politics and always be making the case that support for conservation is in the members' self-interest, because it's something that their constituents care about. And if they care about keeping their jobs, then they have to care about the things their constituents care about. But I'm really fond of the phrase necessary but not sufficient. All of this work is necessary, but it's not enough to get you over the finish line. You need the politics to kind of break your way sometimes, and you need some luck. And more importantly, you have to be smart enough to capitalize on the luck and turn every opportunity to your advantage. So we're going to talk a little bit about what happened in the last couple of years to get us to this point, but let's stop for a second.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. It's Kathy again. Just a reminder, there's a lot of information in here. We're going through a 25-year campaign in, 25 minutes. So remember to ask us questions in the chat. We'll capture those, and we have some time at the end to go through some of them, and we'll follow up afterwards if we don't get to all of them. And thank you so much for the tremendous response on the congressional stuff. Pretty impressive. Back to you, Amy.
Great, thank you. So, as I mentioned before, the first thing that really jolted our campaign forward and took things to the next level was LWCF expiring in 2015. Nobody really expected that, because the bipartisan support and the popularity of the program has been high through its entire history, and it's been reauthorized before with no controversy. But in this day and age, nothing is without controversy, and unfortunately became somewhat politicized, with folks who are no fans of the federal government kind of, characterizing LWCF as a federal land grab, very inaccurately. And so it expired in 2015. And at first blush, that seemed like a crisis, which knocked us off of our strategy and our goal to get full permanent funding, which at that point I had already been working on for 5 solid years. So we really had to change the campaign to put the primary focus on, not on the funding, but on saving the underlying program. But we were able to get a short-term extension for 3 years and use that time wisely. And the urgency that these events created turned out to be a huge asset and a catalyst. It allowed us to put things in stark terms and motivate people with the possible loss of something that has so many benefits for them directly. And So we were able to use countdowns to ratchet up pressure. We created this 52-week countdown, spotlighting beloved places around the country and putting the spotlight on partners in each state and US territories in that year-long countdown, showing what each state actually had at stake, which was awesome and really effective. So that brought us to victory in the Dingell Act, the John D. Dingell Conservation, Recreation, and Management Act in March of 2019. We took a huge education effort in really convincing people of the value of LWCF and a landslide of positive press to pivot back to the funding issue. You may remember in March of 2019, we had come off like a month-long government shutdown. It was a really bad time in DC, and passing this bill right after that helped create a narrative that Congress can still function, that conservation is a unifying issue, and that everyone can win with a bill like this. So we took that and immediately pivoted back to full funding. So this grand pivot lasted for months, celebrating the win on permanent reauthorization and thanking members with all kinds of events and press, while at the same time saying our work is not done. What good is saving the program if its funding keeps getting siphoned off? And so we added, on top of the education campaign that we had built, we added this new level of education about what was happening with the funding, ending up half reverted to the federal treasury every year when not appropriated for projects. So we had already done 80% of the work, and we're able to then build on that. So after a year of making that case and shepherding the LWCF Permanent Funding Act through the committee process in Congress and pressing for it to be taken to the floor, politics broke our way with the president's tweet. And you'll notice a couple of things in this tweet. One is the two senators mentioned. A lot has been made of the two Republican senators from Montana and Colorado in very tight races, pushing this for political reasons, and the president supporting it to help them win re-election. That is entirely true. But it would not have mattered if we hadn't spent the last 10 years building that foundation, that bipartisan foundation, and working on both sides of the aisle. This particular political dynamic was necessary, but not sufficient. And secondly, this tweet is not just about LWCF. It brings full permanent funding of LWCF together with another key issue, restoring our national parks, which is a reference to addressing the deferred maintenance backlog on our public lands. So I'm going to turn it over now to Tyler to talk about that parallel campaign, and then come back to bring the two together in the Great American Outdoors Act.
Great, thank you, Amy. So as Amy mentioned, I'm going to discuss today a parallel and complementary effort that occurred at the same time as the LWCF effort, and that's an effort to address the deferred maintenance across our public lands. I hope that throughout the presentation, you'll notice some similar themes and tactics that were both successfully used in both of our campaigns, which got us to the Great American Outdoors Act. So to start out, I wanted to give you a little bit of a background just so everyone knows kind of what deferred maintenance is if you don't already. Each year that annual or cyclical maintenance is not able to be completed, it becomes what's known as deferred maintenance. And over time, that amount of deferred maintenance has grown to over $20 billion across the National Park Service, Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Bureau of Indian Education. And what happens when deferred maintenance grows is that our public lands begin to suffer from the impacts of that, with crumbling trails, roads, visitor centers, and other infrastructure that impacts the visitor experience, as well as kind of the behind the scenes infrastructure like sewer systems, water lines, and stuff like that, that impact kind of the overall running of these public lands. This deferred maintenance problem really wasn't just created because of like a lack of like work being done. The problem really is exacerbated by increasing visitation pressures that our public lands have seen, as well as inconsistent funding by Congress for the annual maintenance needs. Congress, for the past decade at least, hasn't really funded kind of the maintenance of our public lands at a level that allows all the maintenance every year, for the maintenance every year to be completed. So once we kind of knew what the issue was, sorry about that. So how does kind of the deferred maintenance aspect come into the Great American Outdoors Act? What the bill does, as Kathy mentioned, is it creates a fund to provide $9.5 billion over 5 years to really address the deferred maintenance priorities across our federal lands, including our trails. So $6.65 billion over the 5 years will go to the Park Service, $1.425 billion will go to the Forest Service, and $475 million each will go to BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, and Bureau of Indian Education. And just to give you a sense of the trail maintenance needs, the Forest Service currently has a backlog of $236 million specific to trails, and the Park Service has a maintenance backlog of $461 million specific to trails. So trails are clearly a sizable amount of our overall maintenance needs. And so kind of recognizing this issue and kind of what needed to be addressed, a campaign began about 4 years ago to address the deferred maintenance needs. It was initially led by Pew and the National Park Conservation Association, and eventually was joined by thousands of others under the Restore Our Parks Act effort. And really the goals of the campaign, much similar to the LWCF campaign, was to raise awareness about the deferred maintenance by really using local examples and stories to highlight the everyday impact that deferred maintenance has, kind of identifying specific trails, roads, campgrounds, visitor center, and other visitor amenities that are being impacted by deferred maintenance. This awareness and education was used to generate support for addressing a deferred maintenance across the nation, and really began from the ground up. The coalition overall used data, research, and user-friendly materials to really make deferred maintenance relevant to both individuals and members of Congress, really specifically identifying specific deferred maintenance projects and issues that could be addressed with a comprehensive deferred maintenance package, as well as kind of other benefits within an individual's congressional district or their state, like job creation, economic benefits, and other things that members of Congress specifically are interested in and would be interested in to support the bill. Throughout the work, the coalition managed to enable a campaign that was working in over 35 states, really to highlight and build momentum for this kind of ground up approach, and really kind of create local connections that members of Congress would be able to utilize in supporting the bill. The campaign grew and expanded to eventually include over 3,400 national, regional, and local organizations, including many from the trails community, recreation groups, business community, local elected officials, you name it. It was really a big across the board effort here. And so over the course of the campaign, there was various versions of deferred maintenance bills that were introduced. I'm going to focus today on the Restore Our Parks Act and the Restore Our Parks and Public Lands Act, which are the two bills that primarily became kind of the foundation for what was included in the Great American Outdoors Act. So we had the Restore Our Parks Act, which was introduced in the Senate, that specifically addressed the national park maintenance backlog. This bill was led by a large number of senators. I'll just mention a few, but this is by no means a conclusive list. Senator Portman from Ohio, Senator Warner from Virginia, Senator Alexander from Tennessee, as well as Senator Manchin from West Virginia were all very heavily involved in this effort. And this bill ended up receiving a majority of the senators' support. So 51 senators co-sponsored the bill. And then on the House side, you had a complementary bill called the Restore Our Parks and Public Lands Act. This bill was a little broader in scope and included both the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service, and Bureau of Indian Education. And really kind of thanks to the work of all the trails community, the broader coalition, this bill eventually reached a total of 329 co-sponsors, all because people were reaching out to their local representatives, encouraging support. And most bills in Congress do not reach this level of support. 329 is a very rare kind of co-sponsor achievement, and something that we should all be proud of, and shows that kind of the conservation and trails efforts really are a bipartisan, widely supported issue. Just to mention that on the legislative issues, The overall campaign was really careful to keep various iterations of the bill bipartisan so that it never became a Republican or a Democratic issue, but just an issue for everyone. And the campaign was able to serve as a resource for members to kind of provide each member something that they could turn to really show the benefit of the program. I'll also mention that neither bill initially included the Forest Service, but the trails, recreation, sportsman, and conservation community was working to build education and support for its inclusion. There's not really a specific reason that the Forest Service initially wasn't included, just that the campaign, as I mentioned, began as a park-focused one and was really driven by the Department of Interior. But it really, as the coalition grew and the legislation moved forward, we made an effort to try to get to a comprehensive approach. So talking a little bit more about the effort to reach a comprehensive approach, we really made early efforts by organizations like Mine American Hiking Society, the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, the Core Network, Outdoor Recreation Roundtable, and Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. So kind of really the broad spectrum of recreation and sportsmen and hiking groups to lay a foundation for the inclusion of the Forest Service, which we found and thought was critical to addressing the deferred maintenance issues across all public lands. And we were able to work kind of both behind the scenes with elected officials as well as with the broader coalition to get kind of support for the inclusion of Forest Service and other public lands as part of a comprehensive approach. And so kind of what are some of the tactics that we use to advance the legislation? The trails community really remained engaged on this effort for going back years, especially through our annual Hike the Hill Advocacy Week, which I encourage everyone to participate in next year in March. We also engaged in group letters and other outreach as part of broader coalition efforts, including large coalition letters, drafting op-eds in local papers, engaging in a broad social media campaign, and as I mentioned before, really building up a grassroots effort, as well as kind of doing the direct advocacy in DC, meeting with staffers, committee members, and leadership. And as I mentioned, I think touched on before, the coalition and partners within the coalition, including many of our trail organizations on this, ensured that both members across the aisle received strong support from their districts as the Great American Outdoors Act moved forward, to really thank the senators and representatives for their support and allow them to take credit for the bill. And so our efforts ended up being successful in moving a comprehensive deferred maintenance bill. We were able to, on the House side, to secure commitments from the House bill sponsors, congressional leadership to include the Forest Service as a part of a comprehensive approach prior to the final passage of a bill. And all at the same time, we were working on the Senate side to build support for the other agencies' inclusion in a deferred maintenance package. So broader than the National Park Service to include all public lands. It was really kind of an exciting moment when the tweet heard around the world was sent out. And we really didn't know kind of what a final bill was going to look like and whether a comprehensive approach was going to be included, really until the point of introduction. But thanks to the hard work of the broader coalition, congressional supporters like Senators Heinrich and Daines and others, the coalition and the trails community and the Forest Service were successful in getting a comprehensive approach. So now that we had a kind of a combined deferred maintenance and LWCF bill with the soon to be introduced Great American Outdoors Act, our job was now to get it passed, which I'll turn it back over to Amy to discuss how that was done.
There we go. Thanks, Tyler. So let's see here if I can advance my slides. There we go. So the Great American Outdoors Act, with that comprehensive maintenance approach, as Tyler described for you, was introduced like the day after that tweet. We really moved quickly with bipartisan champions in the Senate, and it was immediately put on the Senate calendar. I would mention, that the deferred maintenance backlog was a longtime priority of the administration, but they had previously used that as an excuse to actually attack LWCF and conservation. They zeroed out LWCF in the budget 3 years in a row, and justified that by saying, well, we can't manage the land we already have, so we can't buy any more. I think we all know that conservation and maintenance are two sides of the same coin when it comes to public lands, right? The deferred maintenance issue definitely impacts both the park resources and trail resources and the visitor experience. It's the same on the conservation side. If you fix the roads and the sewer lines and all of that stuff, but you lose a key inholding, and then you have trophy homes or luxury condos inside a park or in the trail view shed, that has just as much impact on the park or trails, natural resources, and the visitor experience. So we had long made the argument that these two things should move forward together, and the president's tweet signaled that we had won them to our position on that. Whether on the merits or on the politics, it doesn't really matter. But as in the case of getting a comprehensive maintenance solution, it was, a key outcome of our specific advocacy. So the bill was quickly introduced and put on the Senate calendar, and it seemed like this whole campaign, after so many years, might be over in a couple of weeks. And you may remember that time well. It was mid-March of this year. And then we had COVID take over, and a total shutdown of all of our efforts individually and collectively, and a shutdown of Congress's efforts in DC. And so we had to navigate that new world and let Congress focus on immediate relief and response legislation. But as time went by, and we all kind of learned to cope with the situation, there was emerging fresh evidence of the importance of the outdoors. Getting outside is now more valued than ever. We've really seen the tie to physical and mental health. We've seen the stark reality of underserved communities and communities that don't seem underserved, but have so much population that even though there are plentiful parks and trails, they're overrun and crowded. And then we also saw, the real importance of that recreation economy as it crashed. So we adjusted our messaging and pressed on, looking for the next opportunity and looking for inclusion in a potential stimulus package, because it became clear that responding and recovering from the pandemic and recovering economically, that this should be part of that, and this could be part of that. And so politics broke our way again, and Majority Leader McConnell decided to put this on the floor as one of the first bills to be considered that was not direct COVID response and relief legislation. And that came with a lot of challenges that we had to navigate. We had to keep all of our supporters super invested and motivated just to get them to DC, because there were actually 8 procedural votes we had to get through for some really arcane reasons I won't get into, but they were 8 tough votes. At times we needed 60 votes. Actually, on most of those votes, we needed 60. It was in no way guaranteed. And so it was incredibly stressful, and the culmination of all of our efforts to call in every favor with every member. I noticed in the chat, you guys mentioning a lot of great members, and it's clear that you all are very up on your delegations, and I'm sure you played a huge role in helping us get this bill over the finish line, because it really took all hands on deck and every member in order to get through. So, you mentioned some of our greatest champions like Senator Cantwell, Senator Tester, Senator Heinrich, Leahy. On the House side, some of our champs have included newer folks like Representative Torres Small and Representative Stivers of Ohio, has been getting better and better until he became a leader on this issue. You also mentioned swing votes like Whitman and Bergman and Heisinger and Marshall, who also came around to support us with lots of efforts, including yours, I bet. and reluctant folks that we put a lot of effort into, like Newhouse and Colin Peterson, and the Hawaiians, actually, who, you know, for some political reasons, were looking to get more coastal funding. And some we never quite brought around, like Mr. Toomey from Pennsylvania, no matter how hard we worked. So in the end, though, we got over 70% of the Senate and into the House, and got over 70% of the House to vote in favor of this legislation. And again, that foundation was really key. We made a smart pivot when the Democrats took control of the House in 2018, and folks that we had worked with for years, like Mr. McGovern in Massachusetts, became powerful committee chairman or Speaker of the House, Chairman Grijalva of Arizona, and you know, those swing district members who for political reasons are really important and loom large with the leadership in Congress. That is on both sides of the aisle as well. You have those vulnerable Republican senators, you have vulnerable freshman Democrats like Torres Small and Mr. Cunningham from South Carolina, who ended up leading our bill in the House. So all of that effort together got us onto the president's desk. And it's just incredibly exciting. So now what happens? We're gonna stop for another poll question, thinking about the future.
Great. And so now we just want to do a quick poll to see, kind of based on these two presentations and kind of knowing what you've heard so far about LWCF deferred maintenance and the Great American Outdoors Act, whether there's a trail project that could benefit from LWCF deferred maintenance or both through the Great American Outdoors Act. Take about 30 seconds to fill out the poll. And we also encourage you to, in the chat box, identify specific trails and what types of projects, deferred maintenance, LWCF, or both, that could benefit from the Great American Outdoors Act.
And Amy, we have about 5 minutes.
Okay.
If you can wrap it up quickly. Yeah,
Yep.
So we can have some time for questions.
Great.
All right, we're getting some good responses, so I'll just give it about 10 more seconds and then share the poll results quickly. All right, let's see what we have. So it looks like a lot of people, which is great, are thinking that they can benefit from both LWCF and deferred maintenance, which is great for trails. About 13% just LWCF, 3% for deferred maintenance, and about 18% who say not right now, but I'll look for opportunities. And hopefully some of those opportunities will be presented during the next part 2 of the presentation. So I think back to you, Amy.
Thanks. So where do we go from here? We don't have the same kind of immediate pivot right in front of us the way we did after the Dingle Act, but that pivot showed us the power of positivity and thanks. We need to reward good behavior and keep members excited about this issue as a winning, unifying issue that can bring people together. And there's so much more to be done. We all know that there's always more to be done. Implementation will not be easy. No matter what the next administration looks like. But we know the strength in working together and bringing local stories to DC, bringing what's happening in DC down to our partners working on the ground is really key. So there will be challenges regardless of who's in charge. There's an acute budget crisis being faced by the states. Staffing issues from agency budgets being underfunded for years. It's absolutely critical that we get this money in the ground, spend it well, spend it equitably, spend it visibly, and celebrate it to prevent any backsliding and win the win, as we like to call it. And to figure out what comes next. We're facing a climate crisis and a nature crisis. We have so many millions of Americans who don't have adequate access to the outdoors, who've been shut out of the process or feel shut out of the process. And those are things that we need to address moving forward. So here's some examples of the work that we've been doing, celebrating the win in the press and pushing that narrative of bipartisanship. mapping out where the opportunities are now. This is a map TPL, TNC, TCF, and others have all put together of current fiscal year 21 projects and things in the pipeline. If you drill down, you can see some awesome trail projects all over the country. The Nez Perce Trail is an obvious one, Myers Cove less so because it's a Forest Legacy project, but that has a direct impact on Trail of Tears. So we're going to work on getting those projects done and then figuring out what comes next. And, you know, do we need to look at other programs on top of LWCF? Do we need to expand LWCF to actually meet the climate and nature crisis? You know, that remains to be seen. So we look forward to working with all of you in this effort. And thank you so much. We want to take this moment to celebrate. It's been a hard year to celebrate. But success is possible, even in the most challenging times. And the outdoors really can be something that brings Americans together. And so it's been a privilege for me to work on that with all of you and with so many partners in the LWCF Coalition all across the country. So thank you, and I look forward to continuing this work with you.
Okay, thank you, Amy and Tyler. Know if I'm there. I am. We have time for some questions. I didn't see too many come through the chat, but I did see tons of great ideas of where GAOA funding can go for trails, and so we'll be capturing that. And I think that's a really useful jumping off point for what Ron will be talking about in the next presentation. But also, as Amy said, you know, on implementation and making sure this money gets down to the ground in good and effective ways. So thanks for answering and being so engaged in the chat. I need to find the questions. Liz, are you there to?
Yeah, Kathy, I just put the link for you.
Yeah, all right.
Andrea's got them all lined up.
Yep, I've just got to move my screen. Okay, so here's a question. It's clear the administration is trying to move LWCF money to the maintenance side. What is the coalition's strategy to preserve the full 900 million? Well, so it's nothing is really clear, I guess I would say, Ron, and to folks. Supposedly, we believe that the GAOA requires the administration to send lists of projects and program allocations for LWCF to Congress in a week, less than a week now, November 2nd. There's been a lot more evidence of what they've been doing on the deferred maintenance side at DOI than on LWCF. The Forest Service has done an LWCF list according to normal process, sent that to OMB. There's probably a little back and forth, but they followed what I think we all thought was the regular process. So we're just sort of fingers crossed. We've had lots of outreach, right, Amy, to members of Congress?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, our fingers are crossed, but we're certainly not going to just cross our fingers and hope for the best, right? So we've been reaching out to the head of the task force, Margaret Everson. We've been asking members of Congress to reach out to her. We have been working with partners to kind of raise the visibility of what's going on at DOI or what's kind of maybe not clear what's going on, just letting folks know that there's not a lot of evidence that there's a process moving forward here. And so, you know, hoping to, you know, up that scrutiny level a little bit in hopes of, you know, working cooperatively and having a good outcome, but then also, you know, really teeing up our partners across the coalition and members in Congress on both sides of the aisle to respond strongly if there is any hint of moving money out of LWCF and into maintenance, or not having a specific project list, or otherwise either, you know, not abiding by the balance that was outlined in the Dingell Act for federal and state LWCF projects across all of the sub-programs. That's really important. You know, and not just the, you know, complying with how LWCF is supposed to work, but also really complying with that oversight language in the Great American Outdoors Act, preserving congressional appropriators' role in directing the allocations and reviewing those project lists every year was something was really important to members and really important to us because it keeps Congress engaged in the projects and there's no substitute for that, right? So I think, you know, no matter whose the administration is, that's something that we care about. And we want to see that, you know, we want to see that play out the right way. So we're watching closely and we're doing, you know, everything that we can. We're relying on folks to kind of, you know, not think that we can declare victory and leave the field. That's just not how it works.
Okay, thanks. Here's another question. Tyler, maybe you want to take this from Margaret Gorski. Any indication that the funding that the agencies receive through GAOA will be offset in their regular budgets, as in they might cut their regular budgets by that amount, I think is what she means. So Tyler, do you want to take that?
Yeah, thanks. And that's a great question, Margaret. I think Kathy touched on it a little bit in the comments and saying, at least from the agency kind of what's proposed side, we haven't heard that, but that's definitely an issue from the legislative and the appropriations side that our organizations and the broader coalition really should be engaging on and encouraging appropriators that kind of their action with the GAOA to address the deferred maintenance backlog does not take away the need to continually and increase funding for the annual maintenance programs, right? Otherwise, we're just going to end up in the same exact position that we ended up in with a huge deferred maintenance backlog. So I encourage you, as you reach out to your kind of elected officials as part of the appropriations process, to really encourage them to maintain the funding levels and the maintenance levels of the bill. Like that issue, it doesn't go away just because the Great American Outdoors Act addresses the deferred maintenance backlog.
Okay, Amy, here's a good question for you from Amanda Wheelock. Is there any backstage planning, behind the scenes planning for new sources of funding into the LWCF account as the US hopefully transitions away from relying on oil and gas and those revenues decrease?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are thinking about that. It's definitely in the formative stages at this point. We really needed to first establish that concrete tie and make sure that the original promise of LWCF was fulfilled by dedicating those revenues to their intended purpose. But we all know that the conversation is coming sooner or later about the energy mix changing and a transition away from fossil fuels. I think, you know, most of the conversation right now is on you know, stopping any new lease moratoriums on new leasing. And of course, we don't need any new leasing to fully fund LWCF. Nobody at this point is talking about stopping the existing drilling in the OCS. And as long as that drilling is happening, then there should be a conservation offset for it. And that's what LWCF is all about, right? So I think that there's time to consider that question. All energy development has impacts, though, whether it's fossil fuels or renewables. We've seen the land and water and habitat and recreation impacts of big solar and wind as well. So I think conservation offsets like LWCF are always going to be appropriate to discuss. And there may be, you know, a conversation that goes beyond just energy, you know, as we look at, you know, major climate legislation. I think LWCF needs to be part of that, and land conservation is increasingly part of that conversation as the 30 by 30 campaign is ramping up, and understanding of the importance of land conservation to climate change is you know, growing. So yeah, there's a lot of thinking about that, but it's you know, it's not clear how it's all going to play out just yet.
Okay, thanks, Amy. I think we might have time for one short question, but we're pretty much at the end of our time slot. So if there isn't another burning question, I'll just let it hang there for a minute. I don't see anything in the chat. So I do want to thank Amy and Tyler for blasting through all the details. There's so much more that really happened, but that was great. And I hope gave everyone some good insight into what went on and how we can use all of those lessons to continue to get LWCF and the deferred maintenance sides of the equation moving forward together now and into the future. So thank you all for participating. That was great. And we appreciate all the responses in the chat, and we will follow up on anything that we've missed once we look over it again. The next session is at 3:30 on Great American Outdoors Act Part 2. I hope we teed it up so you're dying to go to that one and see what that answer is. So